This is really dramatic. 5 years ago, the prevailing wisdom was that the number of nerve cells that you have was determined by how many you were born with and how many you've lost in the process. And that was it. There was only loss. One direction, inexorable decline. What we now know is that in fact new nerve cells, all kinds of nerve cells are being created all the time. Certain regions, the levels of nerve cells are higher than others. One of the possibly lesser interesting regions is the olfactory bulb, the part concerned with smell. There's a high level of new nerve cells always entering there. But more importantly, one region which has high levels of new nerve cell generation the whole time is the hippocampus. On both sides, that region concerned with memory. That region that is concerned particularly with spatial memory, where things are in space. Now, what we know is that if new nerve cells are created, doesn't mean that they'll survive in their new environment. Once they eventually get there, they're created deep within the brain, just above, in the region just around the ventricles, and then they have to migrate to the region that they're going to stay. And then they have to be incorporated into the neural circuitry. So production of new nerve cells is important, but at the same time, the incorporation of those new nerve cells into the circuits that's required is also just as important. And they depend on two different things. First of all, the level of creation of new nerve cells we now know is influenced by a number of neuromodulators. One of the most important ones is serotonin. Now, serotonin is sometimes called the feel-good neurotransmitter. That's the one that's increased in drugs that are used to treat depression, for example, increase in mood. There are various other drugs that are used, which ecstasy, for example, which increases serotonin levels as well. Now, what's interesting is that the serotonin, which is associated with feelings of enhanced mood, in light of what I was saying earlier, stimulates the growth, the development of new nerve cells and accelerates it. Depression has the opposite effect, reduces it. So once again, mood and the psychological state has a dramatic effect on the rate at which these new nerve cells are generated. But whether they're generated, when they're generated, and other factors such as exercise has an important effect as well. Running will increase the proportion of new nerve cells. But are they actually incorporated? That is determined by, if you will, whether they're actually required. And here it's thought that stimulation, cognitive stimulation, in other words, the actual demand, thinking, determines whether those new cells are actually incorporated into the network of cells. So if there's actually a cognitive demand, if there's a stretch or there is a new skill being learned or some new experience taking place, which needs to be processed, there's a greater likelihood of these new nerve cells being incorporated and surviving. If nothing much is being done with these nerves in terms of cognitive demands, etc., they're generated, they travel, and they die. It's very much a matter of use it or lose it. So while there are factors like mood, exercise, etc., obviously they'll be influenced by diet, which increase the level of new nerve cells, one also wants an optimal mental, intellectual, and affective environment for the incorporation of those new nerve cells. One of the nicest examples of the incorporation of new nerve cells, because they're required, was demonstrated in a nice study in London taxi drivers. London taxi drivers, unlike some other cities, like Melbourne, are required to have a very accurate and detailed knowledge of all the major streets in London. And this is known as the knowledge. And it takes quite a while to pick up this knowledge, and you'll often see in London people on push bikes with maps riding around there. And what they're doing is they're familiarising themselves with the streets of London, etc., because as part of their test, they might be asked, you're picking somebody up from Waterloo Station, you're taking them to Hammersmith Hospital, how would you go? And the person has to describe the shortest route there. So London taxi drivers have generally a very good knowledge of the London streets. And what the study looked at was the size of the hippocampus in a group of control individuals, London and London cabbies. And what they found was that the London cabbies had larger hippocampi. And what's more, the greater their knowledge, the greater their mastery of the streets and knowledge of the streets of London, the bigger the hippocampi were. Now, one thing you can be pretty confident about is that people who were born with large hippocampi didn't automatically become taxi drivers. What we know happened, most likely, is that as they learnt and as they placed demands on those neural networks where things are in space, especially, those new nerve cells were incorporated, were used, and actually caused the hippocampus to expand. We know that the hippocampus will shrink in conditions of stress and depression, for example. And some people have suggested that it's the very shrinkage which in turn makes the depression worse, feeds back on the depression, and that as the new nerve cells are incorporated and the hippocampus maybe regrows, some of the symptoms of depression, where there's no apparent reason for it, will reduce itself. It's a complex interaction between various systems. So the issue of the plastic brain, and by that I don't mean artificial, what I mean is the dynamic brain, the brain that has the capacity to reorganize itself and restructure itself, is something that's been a bit of a revelation to us neuroscientists over the last 15, 20 years, and particularly more recently with the discovery of new nerve cells. And this process takes place throughout life. And what that means is this amazing capacity for reorganization is there throughout life to varying levels. And it has profound implications in the area of education, because clearly any educational experience that is delivered in a context which maximizes the neuroplasticity and the capacity to incorporate new nerve cells that have been already generated is going to be assimilated faster, is going to be learned faster. You are actually building on the natural neural processes that are available there.